Welcome to the Reading Nook. So here in this little segment on my channel is the Reading Nook, where we are reading A Cat's Chance in Hell by Sharon Hannaford at this moment in time. So make sure you've got your drinks and you're good to go. Without choking on your drinks, of course. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of the canvases that we've worked on so far, and all details of current projects are in the comment section below. Big shout out to Sharon Hannaford. Thank you so much for giving me your permission to read this on my channel. It's been great fun, especially the accents. I'm so sorry. As you saw at the start as well, there's a warning. It's for mature audiences, so please, no kids. But other than that, I hope you enjoy. Bye! Chapter 17. When she opened her eyes, it was just past sunrise. She knew she wasn't in her own bed, but the memories of the previous night were so fresh in her mind that she knew immediately where she was. She sat up in a large unfamiliar bed, stretching luxuriously. She felt wonderful. There was no other word for it. The pain in her ribs and shoulder were a distant memory, but it was more than that. She felt right. Like her skin and bones and muscles had not only just fitted together correctly until this moment. Now everything was absolutely as it should be. The world was in sharp focus and she felt warm and energized. Wow, could all that be attributed to the small amount of Julius's blood she'd taken? It seemed ridiculous, but it had to be. There was no other explanation. Pizza sure didn't have this effect on her. If it had, she'd have bought a pizza restaurant years ago. The thought of pizza woke up her stomach, and it growled impatiently. Well, that hadn't changed, she thought wryly, and threw the blankets off to get up and look for a bathroom. She realised her breakfast was going to have to wait until she drove to the nearest bakery or takeaway. Not much chance of finding breakfast in a vampire house. Next, and her other weapons lay on a chair near the door, and her car keys and mobile lay on the nightstand. Force of habit made her pick up the phone to check it. She frowned and blinked, then padded to the window on the opposite side of the room and pulled the curtains back. She peered out at the semi-dark sky in alarm. "Damn," she breathed. "Sunset, not sunrise. Bloody hell, I've slept the whole day." She spun as she heard the almost noiseless opening of the bedroom door. Julius filled the doorway with his wide shoulders, his head just brushing the top of the door frame. She realised she could smell his scent from across the room, and it was a delicious mix of new leather, cinnamon, bark, and the air after a summer storm. She could also smell the latte in his left hand and a bag of pastries in his right. "Is that your idea of a peace offering, leave me to sleep all day?" she growled huffily. "If you wanted to be," he replied. "Would it work as one?" "Not until I've used the bathroom." A sudden feeling of panic swept over her. "You do have a bathroom, don't you?" Julius restrained a grin, nodding his head towards the door on the far side of the antique dressing table. "Yes, they came with the house. We do use the baths and showers, so it seemed unnecessary to remodel completely to our own specifications. The toilets are still in place. Claudia said to tell you that anything else you may need is in the vanity cupboard. I'll leave you to your ablutions," he said, moving to set his offering on the dressing table. "I'll be in the entertaining room when you're done. My office is still in the process of being refurbished," he said with a deadpan expression. Gabby stamped down on the guilt that was threatening to surge through her. It was his own fault. "Don't rush," he added over his shoulder as he headed back out the door. "Carl said he'd go past your house to make sure the rabid animal was fed and watered, and Byron knows where you are." He closed the door behind him as Gabby hurried for the bathroom. After devouring the coffee and pastries, she'd intended to take a quick shower, regardless of Julius's reassurance. She really wanted to get home. She needed a change of clothes and to check on Razor and Slinky. She also needed to get back on patrol. She'd had enough nights off and she didn't want to put too much pressure on the new recruits. But once she stepped into the huge shower with its multiple shower heads and the enormous array of gels, body scrubs and shampoos, she couldn't help herself. She pampered her skin and hair and then stood in the jets of hot water and let them massage the last of the stiffness from her muscles. As she luxuriated in the heat and gentle pressure, her mind whirled through the revelations of the previous night. While many things didn't make sense, one thing was abundantly clear. Her body wanted blood. Not just any blood, Julius's blood. That was really going to complicate matters. By the time she got back to the bedroom, a fresh set of clothes was lying on the bed. They were her own clothes, the sort she'd wear on patrol, so she guessed that meant Carl was back. She grabbed the hairdryer from the dresser and gave her hair a brief dry using her fingers. She dressed quickly and grabbed her keys, mobile, and weapons on her way out the door. She realised as she strode down the corridor towards the large staircase that she'd need to grab some more food somewhere before starting her shift. The coffee and pastries had hardly touched the sides. Several male voices were coming from the entertainment room, and found she could pick out most of them individually. Julius was obvious, as was Carl and Alexander. Two other deeper tones she identified as Liam and Nathan, and then she felt her heart skip in shock when she recognised Byron's milder tones. She covered her unease and strode into the room confidently, nodding to each of the vampires and going to give Byron a peck on the cheek. "What are you doing here?" she demanded in an admonishing tone, throwing a questioning glare at Kyle. "Don't glare at me, Hellcat," Kyle said, throwing his hands up in a defensive gesture. "Not my idea." Byron caught her hands, bringing her attention back to him. "It wasn't Kyle's idea, Gabby," he agreed. You can stop blaming him. I felt I needed to talk to Julius and Alexander myself after Kyle told me what they revealed to you last night about their Danfair legends." When Gabby's grim expression didn't soften, Julius said evenly, "He has my protection, Gabby. He is safe here, and no one in this house will speak of his presence here or his association with you or the society. I have made absolutely sure of that." He emphasised the last words enough for Gabby to know how he'd made sure of it. She relented slightly and her angry stance eased. "Gabby," Byron said evenly, "it's not just the Danfair legends that have brought me here. We've had some disturbing news and I wanted to discuss this with Julius as well. I've waited for you so that you can discuss it together. I've asked Julius to include his most trusted lieutenants." He nodded towards Liam and Nathan. Byron was keeping his voice calm and moderate, but Gabby could detect the underlying stress in it. She took a deep, steadying breath. This wasn't going to be pretty. Gabby was in the mood for a good fight. She was still trying to be mindful of the possibility of the red rage returning. Julius had said there was a good chance it would, and she wasn't going to let it claim her again. It rankled that this was supposed to be simply a reconnaissance mission. When Byron had told them about the Magi Seers picking up the sense of evil emanating from this particular building, he insisted that they were only to find out what was inside and not go rushing in until they knew what they were facing. She and Julius were being trailed by 3 of his personal guards, Nathan, Fergus, and Marcello, as they stalked silently through the dark alleyway. From the alley on the far side of their targeted building, Gabby heard a cat hiss and the sound of claws on a rough concrete as it took flight. Those were the only sounds that gave away the location of Carl and Alexander's group, which was closing in from the other side. A slight breeze eddied through the narrow street, making Gabby wrinkled her nose at the array of malodorous smells that stirred up as it passed. Ugh, her ultra-sensitive sense of smell she could almost do without. She moved forward cautiously, trying to resist the urge to check that the vampires were still behind her. They were so quiet and moved so smoothly to her normal senses she felt utterly alone. Only a supernatural ESP told her that they were all less than 5 meters from her. She held up her hand and brought the group to a halt, while she opened her senses to feel what was waiting for them inside the building. It was a relatively modern warehouse in an industrial area, and there was some kind of magical protection around it. She still wasn't getting anything from it. Her senses were just picking up the whole building as a solid supernatural being. She couldn't penetrate the shell to find out what and how many waited inside. "This is so off," she said, low in her throat. They were all wearing digital comlink devices, state-of-the-art and only barely available to the military elite. Lord and Lady only knew where Byron had managed to get them. They consisted of a small plastic patch, the size of a plaster, stuck on each of their necks, near their voice boxes, as well as a smaller, barely visible patch placed behind each ear. They each also had a titanium-encased microprocessor, the size of half a credit card, taped to their bodies, somewhere that was up to personal preference. And Gabby had hers, much to the amusement of the males, taped inside her bra. She knew it would be safe there and had little chance of falling off. "Still nothing?" Carl's quiet voice came through so clearly it felt like he was speaking directly into her skull. "Nothing but a really bad feeling," she murmured back. "So we are agreed then," Julius chimed. "We wait for your Magus?" Gabby sighed. "Yes, we wait for Athena," she agreed irritably. She'd better hurry up. Gabby was officially top dog of this mission, something that the vampires had agreed to surprisingly easily. Apparently demons made vampires as nervous as anyone else, but she was treating it more as a collaborative effort. It seemed pointless to her to ignore the input of men who had been in more conflicts than she would ever see in her lifetime. She tried not to have an ego when it came to that sort of thing. Ego could get you killed quicker than anything else in this game. Gabby's group moved back down the alleyway to where a large dumpster offered protection from the weak moonlight filtering through the clouds and hunkered down to wait. The vampires were eerily still. Gabby had to restrain herself from fidgeting. Staying still with adrenaline pumping was not usually an option for her. Her restless energy needed an outlet. "Cal," she said softly, "you'd better go and meet Athena and bring her in. Don't forget she doesn't know much about being quiet, so you'll have to give her some pointers. Get her to try it from a distance first. The closer she gets, the higher chance they'll hear her." "Gotcha," Carl's voice came back. "On my way." "Do you think we need to check the rear section?" She asked no one in particular, but Julius replied. "It was reported as having no exit points, but it can't hurt to be sure," he murmured softly. She suppressed a small, delicious shiver. "Marcello," he said, the order clear. The slightly built vampire gave a quick flash of teeth and was gone. Gabby chewed on her lower lip and ran her fingernails up and down the rigid hilt of a dagger strapped to her side, her eyes constantly roving over the darkened windows and doors on their side of the building. Julius smiled as he watched her. He could see it was taking every ounce of her control to keep from pacing. Being still was not a natural state for her, he'd come to realize. Even when she was sitting or sleeping, she wasn't still for more than a few seconds at a time, constantly in motion. He'd spent a long time watching her sleep today. He couldn't explain why he hadn't been able to drag himself out of the room. Watching her had given him both a strong sense of peace and calm, as well as an intense protective anxiety as he replayed his recent premonition over and over again in his mind, determined to find a way to change it. Eventually the sun had risen well above the horizon, and the brightness of the room had become uncomfortable. All the rooms in the house had blackout blinds, but he'd thought she would feel better if she woke up to sunlight rather than utter dark, so he'd left hers open and retired to his own room to muse. It had been mid-morning before he fell asleep, and then Alex had roused him an hour before sunset to discuss some business. Most vampires would have felt sleep-deprived with the little sleep, but he had developed the ability to handle it, and could even go an entire day without sleep, something few vampires ever mastered. "Athena's here," Carl reported in a low voice. "She's starting the counterspell now. She says it will take a few minutes." "Oh, shit." Marcello's accented voice came softly but fervently through the comlink. "What?" barked Julius, even as the four shadows crouched near the dumpster reared up and sped towards the rear of the building. "There's an underground opening here," Marcello said tersely. "It's been made to look like a manhole cover, but the scents around it indicate recent use by demons and some other creature I've never smelt before." "Fall back and get out of sight. We don't want them to know that we're here," Gabby hissed. "Too late," Marcello grunted, and they could all hear the sound of his sword clearing its sheath. The other four followed suit, drawing their respective weapons, abandoning self and running full tilt down the alley. "Cal," Gabby shouted, "spread out your men and keep the other exits covered. And keep Athena working on the counterspell. We need to know what we're dealing with." They let the 8-foot wire fence at the end of the alley without pausing and rounded the corner into a grimy, unlit parking lot. Marcello was backing towards them, his swords out, swinging mechanically in front of him with a wicked-looking dagger in his left hand. Pouring out of the ground were hulking, misshapen human forms, hissing, grunting, and snuffling. As the pale moonlight bathed them in an eerie blue glow, it was clear that there was no consciousness behind their flat, dead eyes, no thought behind their jerky, uncomfortable movements, simply mindless hunger. "Ghouls!" she breathed in horror. "Dozens of them!" "What the fuck?" Fergus's revulsion was clear in his voice as the smell of rotting meat rolled over them in a tangible cloud. "They're ghouls," Gabby repeated. "Humans who've been bitten by demons. They've become mindless, hungry things. I've only come across 2 before. They're very hard to kill. They'll eat anything that comes near their mouth, so keep your body parts away from them. Not very clever, but they don't bleed out. They don't seem to feel pain." How do we kill them? Julius said tersely, sizing up the horde that was spreading out and lumbering towards them. He'd heard stories about ghouls, but he'd never thought to encounter any. They were enough to even make him shudder. Only one way I know of for sure. Kyle, she called. We need lamps here, and as many flamethrowers as Byron can find. Now! She addressed her small group without looking at them, once again the cold, hard Angeli Morte. We'll have to fend them off as best we can until the flamethrowers get here. Chop off limbs, heads, but be aware that the chopped off bits keep moving. You can still do damage, especially the mouths. Alexander's voice came over the comlink for the first time. We're on our way, he said. Carl's voice broke him before he could say more. Athena's almost done. Byron's got the message about Lance and the flamethrowers. Lance should make it here in about 15 minutes. The flamethrowers could be closer to 20. Oh, Gabby gasped, swaying on her feet. Julius caught her arm and steadied her without taking his eyes off the ghoul army. The warehouse, she said shortly, by way of explanation. Lex, stay where you are. The warehouse is full of demons. I count 6. At least 3 vampires. She shook her head in frustration. They're moving too much. They're heading for the street side entrance. We'll hold the ghouls here. You and Carl stop the demons inside, getting away. Keep Athena with you to banish them if you can't kill them. She didn't hear whether Alexander agreed or not as the first of the ghouls rushed them and the onslaught began. The demon-infected humans might have been ungainly, uncoordinated, and lacking in anything except the most basic of intelligence, but they made up for it with the speed and strength and complete lack of reaction to pain. Gabby and the vampires were faster and stronger, but hugely outnumbered. The small group set their backs to the wall of an adjoining building and began chopping off limbs, stabbing, spearing, beheading. Their world narrowed down to a blur of hands and mouths and crude metal weapons. The ghoul army soon began to look like something out of a cheap horror movie. Cuts and gashes, missing limbs, gaping wounds as the defenders set about cutting them to pieces. Gabby found herself sparing regular glances at the rough tarmac, looking for groping hands and gnashing mouths. She was intensely glad that ghoul saliva didn't affect like demon saliva did, as she already had several sets of tooth marks on her calves and ruined boots would have to be binned after the fight. It was an all-out slaughter of ghouls, but for each one they cut down, another took its place, and the arms and hands of the first began moving towards them, or moving towards the bodies that had been severed from. Headless, limbless bodies careened around crazily, bumping into others or rolling around on the ground. Gabby noticed some of them picking up severed pieces and it looked as though the pieces were trying to reattach themselves. They didn't spout blood when you dissected them, but oozed thick red gore instead. The ground was gradually being coated in it, and was becoming slick and slippery. Through the comlink she could hear the occasional sound of grunts and groans, as well as Carl and Alexander shouting orders, but pushed it all to the back of her consciousness. She'd hear if something had gone horribly wrong on their side. She and her band of vampires were barely holding their own. Nathan was the most silent of the vampires, fighting with a single-minded intensity, always casting glances to see where Julius was, trying to be close enough to defend his sire. Fergus fought like a madman, a controlled madman, she corrected mentally as she ducked to avoid a metal fencing stake being used like a baseball bat. Fergus looked like a man who loved battle. He was grinning from ear to ear and picking up body parts and flinging them across the parking lot as he bellowed insults and dared the ghouls to get to him. Gabby was relieved that his voice transmitter had been turned off or broken. He appeared to be having the time of his life. Marcello was quick and agile, darting in and cutting a ghoul down before it even knew he was close enough. He was utterly intent on his objective, but hadn't seemed to lose the initial horror of what they were fighting. He shuddered every time he got close to one of them and had a permanent horrified grimace on his handsome face. Julius was poetry in motion. His swordsmanship was consummate, his movements quick, lithe and confident, his expression intense and focused. He spared a quick glance her way, throwing her a ghost of a grin as he effortlessly decapitated another ghoul and set to chopping its groping arms off. Gabby and the vampires were keeping to a tight defender's formation, leaving each other room to swing but watching each other's backs, and gradually moving around the edge of the parking lot, keeping the solid walls of the other building to their backs. They needed to keep moving to avoid standing on the bodies, limbs, and entrails littering the ground they'd been fighting on. As they went, the small group fell into a routine of fight, dismember, kick and throw body parts as far away as possible, and then fight, dismember, kick, fight. At some point, the waxing moon broke through the barrier of clouds and lit up the combat zone. Gabby found her eyes drawn to the mass of attackers. She tried to count heads, well, attached heads anyway. Dozens of dead eyes glittered at her in the pale light. She gave up counting at 20 as the horror of the number turned humans began to dawn on her. This couldn't be accidental. Demons weren't often capable of leaving a human alive once they attacked. This had to be an orchestrated event. As yet another ghoul rushed her, she realised that it wasn't only men who'd been infected. She'd seen some women amongst them, only recognisable by longer hair and daintier bodies. But the one rushing her now was barely more than a child. Seemed to have been a young girl. Once. Her ragged denim and dark, grimy t-shirt were sexless, but her features were refined, and her hair longer than was fashionable for a boy. Her body hadn't had the time to even develop curves. Gabby suppressed a shudder and shoved down her feelings of guilt and horror. The dead eyes fastened on her. The ghoul child bared its teeth and lunged for her. She dispatched the youth as quickly as possible and kicked the arms and head away to the side of the fracas. She span away, scanning for her next victim. "Shit!" she cursed as she almost fell over something in the dark. Righting herself, she found her head rolling on the tarmac, mouth open in a macabre grin, tongue waving hungrily. She aimed a boot at it and sent it flying through the air into the chest of a newcomer just entering the edge of the fray. "Thanks," the newcomer said with a grimace. The vampires all spun towards the voice. None of the ghouls had said an intelligent word throughout the entire fight. "Lance!" Gabby yelled with relief. "Sorry about that." She grinned as he kicked the head away from him back into the carnage. She wiped a smear of gore across her face as she slashed next across the throat of another ghoul. "Feel free to help out, but keep the flames." She broke off for a moment to duck under the swinging crowbar, and then spun to finish off hacking the head from burly shoulders. "Away from our allies," she nodded towards the vampires who had returned to the fight once they realised Lance was on their side. "Sure thing, Hellcat," Lance replied, lazily kicking away a ghoul who'd rushed towards him. In the next instant, a ghoul near the back of the freight emitted a loud, unearthly yell and began smoking. Within seconds, he was engulfed in flames. The rest of the mindless creatures didn't seem to even be aware that one of them was standing burning in their midst. They simply moved around him, though they seemed to take care to avoid the flames. "Holy fuck!" Fergus exclaimed, pausing to look at the suddenly burning ghoul in astonishment. He glanced back to Lance with a gleeful amazement. "Now that's a handy talent to have," he shouted with approval. Lance gave the imposing vampire a self-mocking bow just as another ghoul burst into flames. Fergus roared with laughter and renewed his attack on the ragged remains of the ghoul army. Gabby could feel the muscles in her arms beginning to burn. It wasn't often they had to fight such a sustained battle. Usually by this stage, whoever they were fighting would have backed off to regroup, giving both sides time to catch their breath. But the ghouls simply kept coming, and would until the very last of them had been cut down and burned. "Kyle," she called, "what's happening on your side?" His voice came back sounding a little breathy. "One vampire made a run for it. Liam and Alex are chasing him down. We're dealing with the last of the demons. The other two vamps are dust," he reported. "Alexander?" Julius's voice didn't betray a hint of the fight he was in the middle of. "Take that one alive." "Yes, boss," Alexander replied in mild sarcasm. "We're trying, but he's not making it easy. Ugh, I think we have him cornered now." The first of the burning ghouls collapsed into the tarmac and disintegrated. Another 5 or 6 were burning where they stood. Gabby glanced around, assessing how many were left. They seemed to have stopped pouring out of the hole in the ground, but she couldn't know if there were any more inside. Ghouls didn't show up on her radar like demons and other supernaturals did, apparently. She started making her way to the underground entrance to try and look inside. "The flamethrowers are about 3 minutes away, Gabs," Carl's voice echoed in her head. "We've cleared the warehouse. Charlie is going to stay with Athena out front and wait for the flamethrowers. Quentin and I are on our way to you." "Watch your step when you get here." Gabby warned with a grunt as she kicked another head away into the darkness. Then she ducked into the shadows away from the main fight, grateful for the clouds that once more obscured the moonlight as she rounded the dwindling horde and made for the gaping hole in the ground. She heard Julius curse suddenly as he realized she'd slipped away. "Gabrielle, what are you doing?" he demanded over the comlink. "Don't worry," she replied. "I'm just going to see if that's the last of them. I'm sure you'll hold your own without me for a minute or two." She rubbed briefly at a numb spot on her left shoulder where she'd taken a hit from a crowbar. She'd hardly felt it at the time, but the numbness was wearing off, and a deep ache was creeping in. She reached the entrance and peered inside. It was dimly lit. Obviously, ghouls didn't have the best night vision. She could see a short flight of rudimentary wooden steps leading down into the narrow passageway crudely dug out of the earth. She couldn't see further than a few meters where the passage hit a T-junction, one side heading straight towards the warehouse, the other leading away from it. "Damn," she swore softly, realizing she was going to have to go down and check. She looked up to see if the rest were holding their own and flinched as the shadow moved next to her. "It's just me," Julius said quickly as next came up. "Don't you know better than to sneak up on a girl in a ghoul fight?" "You're not going down there alone," he said. His tone brokered no argument, which only made Gabby want to argue, of course. Fortunately, common sense prevailed and she simply said, "Fine," and started down the steps before he could get in front of her. She heard his faint, exacerbated growl as he followed her. She peeled the small voice receiver off her skin behind her ear and tucked it in a pocket. The litany of shouts and commands was becoming too distracting. The corridor was just wide and high enough for her to move around comfortably, meaning it was too narrow and too low for Jules. It didn't make him move any less gracefully, but it did make him hunch his shoulders and try to pull his head in like a tortoise. Her self-satisfied smirk lasted until she cautiously peered around the first bend. The corridor to the left ran for another few meters and ended in a short flight of steps leading up to a solid-looking metal door. That would lead to the warehouse, she was sure. The corridor to the right grew slightly wider and extended in a straight line as far as she could see in the dim light thrown from a few makeshift fluorescent lanterns hanging from the ceiling. On either side of the corridor, crude doorways were hacked into the hard-packed earth walls. There were dozens of doorways spaced about 4 meters apart, each sporting a rough wooden door. Most of them stood open, but a few were still shut tight. She felt the cool, muscled weight of Julius's body as he pressed close to her to peer around the corner too. She felt her mouth fill with saliva and the now almost familiar ache in her canines as his scent enveloped her. She forced her mind back to the dank, earthy passageway and its closed doors. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "More of them behind the closed doors?" She looked back at him. "Let's go find out." They moved cautiously into the wider passage and crept to the first door, which was standing open. They peered in, assessing for danger with all their senses. "Seems clear," Julius murmured softly. Gabby nodded in agreement, then warily entered the underground room. It had also been hacked out of the bare earth. It was damp and cold, lined with rows of what looked like crudely made bunk beds. There was an open hole in the ground in one corner, and Gabby and Julius could tell what it was for without going to check. The stench was almost enough to be a physical force. The floor was littered with bones and small skulls. Nothing looked human. Probably dog, cat and rat, Gabby thought with a shiver of revulsion. Having quickly established that there was no threat in the empty room, they moved to the first closed door. It was bolted shut from the outside by a thick steel rod. They paused to listen carefully. Gabby knew Julius's hearing would be better than hers, so she looked at him expectantly. After he pressed his ear to the roughened wood, Gabby could hear sniffling and what sounded like quiet moaning. "How many?" she mouthed at him. "At least 3, he mouthed back. "Ready?" she whispered, settling next comfortably in her right hand and pulling another knife from her thigh sheath. Julius pulled her hand from the bolt. "My turn," he said, putting his own hand on the bolt and drawing it back before Gabby could do more than roll her eyes. They burst through and shifted into defensive crouches either side of the door, ready for anything. Nothing happened. There were 3 figures huddled on 2 almost bare pallets. None of them moved to attack. One whimpered in fear, and another began crossing itself repeatedly, muttering what sounded like the Lord's Prayer. The others just sat still, like the proverbial deer in headlights. There were 2 bodies lying in the far corner of the room, well into decomp by the smell of them. The live ones were sitting on a couple of filthy, threadbare blankets, and were dressed in dirty, tattered clothing. Their hair was dishevelled, matted, and all 3 were male, if the ratty facial hair was anything to go by. "They're still human," Gabby whispered, not sure if she was speaking to herself or Julius. "They could still be infected," Julius warned. "Maybe they haven't had time to become fully ghoul yet. How long does the transformation take?" "I don't know," Gabby replied. "How long have you been here?" Julius demanded of them. They all just looked at him in utter terror. Not one of them could get a word out. The one who had been moaning began to cry softly. "Bugger, they're scared shitless," Gabby cursed roundly. "We'll leave them here for now. Baron will know what to do with them. Let's carry on and see what other horrors this crypt holds." They backed out of the cave-like room, and Julius shot the bolt back into place. As they headed towards the next doorway, the acidic stink of burnt flesh, hair, and clothing came wafting down from the entranceway. Apparently the flamethrowers had arrived. They checked 3 more open rooms and found all of them in much the same state as the first, give or take a body or 3. Gabby had begun holding her breath whenever they entered one. The stench was stomach-churning. She was sure she wouldn't feel like eating for a week. The next door they came to was closed. The sounds on the other side seemed familiar, almost identical to what they had heard from the other occupied room. If anything, the sniffling sounded more like crying. They didn't let up their guard. They entered the same way as before, quickly and ready for anything. On the pallets this time was a woman, holding a small body in her lap. She was facing away from the door, her shoulders hunched protectively as she sniffled over the limp bundle in her arms. Gabby froze in shock. A mother and child in these conditions? Her stomach rolled nauseously, but her anger burned white-hot. She unfroze, moved closer to the pair, wanting to see if there was any hope for saving the child, though she could only hear one heartbeat beside her own. As she bent towards the woman, she heard Julia say, "No, Gabby, I don't—" And in that instant, the woman struck. Hurling the body of the child off of her, she spun and plunged a splintered shard of wood straight into Gabby's side. "No, you can't have her!" the woman shrieked. "Child of Satan, she's mine! You can't have her!" The woman was raving now, screaming as she gathered up the pitiful small body and backed into a corner like a brutalized animal. "Gabrielle!" Julius shouted in alarm. He reached her before reality did and caught her as she swayed towards the dirty floor. Her hand clutched at the crudely made stake protruding from just under her right ribs. "Fuck," she said slowly as she felt hot sticky blood seep into her hands. Bum bum bum. See you next week. Bye.